What's up, YouTube family? My name is Shaka and this is African-American-Made. Today I'm talking with Mr. Kareem Neal, the 2019 Arizona Teacher of the Year and a 2022 inductee into the National Teachers Hall of Fame. The esteemed Mr. Neal has invited me to Phoenix High School to talk about his exemplary career as a special education teacher, his expertise in restorative justice and diversity and inclusion, and what inspired him to devote his life to shaping young minds. I'm impressed with Mr. Neal's accomplishments and only hope to mirror his success in my work. So, sit up in your seats, prepare to take notes, because today we're taking lessons from Mr. Kareem Neal. Okay, how are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well, and thank you so much for meeting with me today. I've done quite a few interviews in the last couple of months, and this is one of the few interviews that I really look forward to. Very impressed with your accomplishments and what you've done in the education field, so I'm very happy to talk to you today. So just give us your name and tell us a little bit about yourself.
My name is Kareem Neal. I am a high school self-contained special education teacher. I teach at Maryville High School in the Phoenix Union High School District. This is my 24th year teaching. I started my career in New Jersey. I moved here right after graduate school, after my first year and a half of teaching, I believe. And I've always taught self-contained. I've always taught high school. I've always taught special education. I am, let's say, I'm 48, so I've been teaching half my life. I am this 2019 Arizona Teacher of the Year, and I am the first teacher inducted from Arizona, inducted into the National Teachers Hall of Fame.
Yes, very impressive, and I definitely wanted to dive into that. You must be stellar in your career there to achieve such amazing accomplishments. So, kudos to you for that.
Thanks.
And thank you for being a shining example of what we as black men, men in particular, but black men specifically, are doing in education. So I thank you for that. You've spent most of your career in education, and you've covered a lot of fields in education. What motivated you and what inspired you to go into education?
So it was actually the Special Olympics, which the organization of Special Olympics, I'll go to bat for at all times. I even jumped off the highest building in Arizona for the Special Olympics of Arizona. There was a Special Olympics event. I was there. I interacted with some of the athletes, and I fell in love with their authenticity. And I was wondering, at the time I was a chemical engineering major in college in New Jersey at Seton Hall University. And after that day, I said, I want to be around folks that are this authentic, and I want to see if I can carve out a place for myself in that world. Because I think, being a college kid, I was a junior in college. I think you oftentimes, dress, act, talk like all of your peers, and it was refreshing to see folks being authentic. And I think I was also craving that authenticity for myself, and so it was helpful being around those students.
You're the first African American to be recognized in Arizona for Teacher of the Year. Mm-hmm. How did that happen? Well, I guess I know how it happened, but I mean.
Yeah, so, to be Teacher of the Year, you got to be nominated. You go through a big process.
You got to be a bad boss teacher, right?
You got to do a lot, teaching-wise. But, it being the first black person, I didn't realize it at the time. So I was just nominated and was like, okay, and it's quite a process. It takes about 4 months, and you got to go through a lot of writing and then a lot of interviewing and impromptu speeches, and they're in your classroom recording and all kinds of things. And while that process was happening, I didn't really think of it. And someone actually said to me, it was really interesting. It wasn't a black person. I think probably black people could relate to this. Somebody said to me, well, it was the 30 at the time that I was named. It was the 35th year, I believe, of the state teacher year, or 30th year, I forgot, but I know it was one of those anniversary years. And they were like, well, I was top 10, and it was like, well, it's got to be you, right? There's not been a black person. And I was like, well, I don't think I love the odds of 0-30 or 0-35, right? Because I think people just assume, oh, something didn't happen. you're a black person. A black person has never been a state teacher of the year in Arizona. It'll be you. And I was like, well, first of all, it's not like I've been the first black person who taught in Arizona, and I'm not the first black person who's been nominated for this award. So it doesn't just come from that. It's important, but sadly, the world isn't always thinking about that kind of representation. It would be nice for me to have taken that for granted. Like, oh, they haven't had that kind of representation. Mm-hmm. It is now time, but that's not how it works, Mm-hmm. And so basically, I have a really solid teacher resume, and I've done all the things, and I was really proud to represent Blackness, because it is not something that is ever given. It is really weird sometimes that people are thinking somehow, this, affirmative action type stuff is gonna happen, but that's not how the world's usually working. When you look at all of the big awards, most of the big awards, you look at big positions in companies, it's still not taken up by black people. So it's not like people are giving you stuff because you're black. So, I felt like a lot of black people, I feel like it's an uphill climb. When you see organizations, if the organization seems like black people aren't a part of it, why would you think you're gonna be the person, right? So it was a lot, but I know how much I love teaching and how much I dedicated to it. So it wasn't like it was gonna stop me for accepting the nomination and trying the process. Yeah.
And the recognition comes from your hard work and diligence in the field.
Definitely.
So
yeah.
Black or not, we get caught up on that, but to your point about the affirmative action approach to it, you still got to get in the door. You still got to show and prove, right?
Exactly.
So,
but they're not going to just give you it.
Right.
I know this because, again, I was the first person, and it wasn't like I was the first black teacher in Arizona. So.
Absolutely. Why special education?
So, like I said, it started from that. It started from the Special Olympics, right? And
your experience
with
Special Olympics.
Authenticity, and I never wavered from teaching folks with special needs. And I think part of it, like particularly when I went to college, I had like that activist spirit that I think a lot of young black folks have. Particularly, black men, we talked about that. You're just not seeing a lot of them. So a lot of times on college campus, we're out there trying to organize, trying to find ourselves, right?
Absolutely.
I was reading all the black literature that I wasn't getting in high school and things like that. I was coming into my own as an activist. It was around the time of the Million Man March and things like that, because I was out there in North Jersey, and a lot of things happened and kind of black power movement over time, and like Malcolm X was there and all of that stuff. And so I think, when I went to special ed, I didn't go into that for the activism. Like I said, I went into it because I saw a bunch of folks who were really authentic people. But being in it satisfies that for me too, because I feel like these are folks who who I need to fight for as well, right? Like I will never stop this fight for justice for black people, right? And in all of my walks of life, but I took on that approach also for special education. I don't think individuals can be activists for all things. A lot of people talk about that. There's a whole spectrum of things you could be advocating for, fighting for. But for me, as I got deeper into this role as special ed teacher, I really said, man, they need some powerful voices, just like the black community needs some powerful voices. So even though the struggles are different, it was still me saying, all right, I do have some power. Everybody has some power, And so the people who have learning differences, people who are learning in different environments than what is standard, are also being overlooked. Their classrooms are being ignored and they're underfunded, and testing is hard for them and things like that. And the world's not viewing them in a way, I think, that is just. So I think what keeps me going, keeps me fresh after 24 years, is part of that advocacy too, and that activism that I'm saying, oh, they also need someone fighting for them. they're going to fight for themselves too, but they need somebody out there in the world who can do it on a different level. So that keeps me in there as well, yeah.
Absolutely. I think that advocacy is something that only certain individuals with a certain heart does.
Yeah.
Most of the world just goes by, as you stated, and we recognize that there are people in the world with challenges. However, that's about as far as it goes.
Yeah, and I think that's some of the beauty of of Black culture. I talk a lot about little C culture, which is like your daily rhythms of life, and big C culture, which is like your community and what that how they typically work, live, etc. And I do think being in the Black community, you are used to fighting for things. You are taught by elders, by leaders, that you got to go out there and fight for a more just world for you. And so that's why it would be great if there were more Black educators in the field, particularly Black male educators in the field, because we're lacking in that department in terms of numbers. Because, we have an activist spirit, by nature, by culture, right? We have been taught that by our elders. We have been taught that by history, that we're going to have to fight for some stuff.
And our experiences, too, right?
And our experiences, exactly.
You mentioned something that caught my attention. You mentioned cultural competency. Explain that.
So when I talk about, because a lot of people talk about cultural competency or culturally relevant teaching and leading, in the sense of, right, so like, for instance, if you looked at my classroom, there's a lot of Mexican-American stuff in here, because I teach a lot of Mexican-American kids and a lot of Black kids and some Native American stuff. And I think a lot of people think that, cultural relevancy, cultural responsiveness, culturally responsive teaching and leading is that, just recognizing a culture. But I think it is more finding a way to truly get to understand people's daily rhythms of life and people's big, like I said, big C culture and little C culture. So the big part of your culture, like how do they worship? How are they activists or not? What does religion typically look like? Family structures typically look like, those big ones. But also on the ground, what are they caring about in their daily rhythm of life? How do they move? Where do they shop, eat, consume on TV and things like that? And so for me, I would say it's about finding a way to just get to know the culture. You're not being a part of it, because you're not going to be a part of someone else's culture, but finding a way to truly meet the people where they are and take the time to understand them and their culture.
Now, when in that regard, are you referring to your culture as educators or among peers as far as your students are concerned, or is it all encompassing?
Yeah, I think of most things and on how students are concerned. So I think about it like that. Like when people go into classrooms, I think a lot of well-intentioned people will go into a classroom and say, okay, I'm teaching a primarily Black population, so I probably should have some Black scientists and artists and things like that, which you should, right? And I probably should make sure, whether it be Black History Month or other, that I find ways to make sure Blackness is represented when we're doing our lessons and things like that. But I think it is still important to get to know the culture that is not just Blackness as a worldwide thing, but the culture is Blackness in Maryville. How does that show up? And the reason why I say that is because I came from New Jersey, right? And Black folks in New Jersey are not like Black folks in Arizona and Phoenix, right? And so it would be a disservice to my kids to ignore historical Blackness, but on the ground, how is Blackness showing up in Maryville? And then if I go back to Trenton, where I was raised, how does Blackness show up in Trenton, New Jersey? Right? And so I'm thinking about in students, like, are we taking the time to get to know, are we taking field trips in the community? Are we asking students what they're about, right? Because when I was young, if someone had said to me, outside of the big stuff, family structures, religion, and things like that, what is your culture? I'd be like, hip hop, right? I was raised, hip hop was super popular, Rakim and KRS and those folks. And for me, if someone would have touched upon that, dove into that, I would have said, okay, they respect me because it meant a lot to me.
Yeah.
And so I think you got to get to know both sides, right? I think it's easier to understand, learn about, represent the big part of people's culture, right?
Gotcha.
It's easy for me to come in here and say, I'm going to throw up some Frida and Diego Rivera and Cesar Chavez posters for my Latino kids. I got a bunch of books that are in Spanish and, whatever. Those kinds of things are easy for me to understand. I understand that, okay, the strong religious views and things like that, but it took me more time to understand kind of the daily rhythms of life of the Hispanic people and the Mexican American people in Maryville.
So just like hip hop, perhaps maybe most kids, and we always associate that with an urban life, right? But most black kids don't identify with urban life.
Exactly.
Parallel what you're saying about Diego Rivera and other, what we would call historical Hispanic icons.
Yeah.
Maryville, they may not know anything about no Diego
Exactly.
Rivera.
So interesting for them.
I find that in the black culture too.
Same, right?
Right.
Interesting for them
you
to
start
learn
talking
about it.
Some people, you're like, oh,
That's right.
You're like, what? You don't know?
Yeah.
Right.
And so it's great for folks to learn about them, right? So it's nice when I get to teach a lesson on Frida, I get to teach a lesson on Cesar Chavez. Those things are great. And then you are feeling, heard, seen, and whatever. But that doesn't mean that's the thing that connects.
Right, because it may be local icons.
Exactly. So if you're not out in those communities, if you're not getting to know your students, you might be missing the local icons, the current political landscape of, the community and things like that.
So it becomes like, it's almost like a non-black person walking up to you talking about Malcolm X and like they know what's up. And you're like, man, get out of here. Like,
exactly.
Right. So it's like patronizing almost.
So when I deal in culture, I want people to think about both levels of culture.
That makes sense. Yeah, absolutely. That's beautiful. So you're a self-contained education teacher. That may be painfully obvious to other people, but give me a little insight on that.
Okay, so self-contained essentially would be, classes in which the students are with, the same peers and teachers for the balance of their day, right? So it often, you actually don't typically hear the term too often in elementary programs, because a lot of times elementary programs, kids are with one teacher all day anyway. But when kids come to high school, that's not usually the case, but in self-contained classrooms they are. And that is because folks need medical aid, they need sometimes behavioral modifications, and they need kind of strict academic modifications. And so they need to be with teachers who are trained for that, and they need to be in classrooms that are safe for them. They are not moving on the broader campus without some adults around. That kind of stuff is what self-contained mean. Sure, they do have the opportunity to be in the cafeteria with their peers and PE class with their peers, but it wouldn't quite work if bell rang and all the students in my classroom went out into the hallways and went to different classrooms. That would be a challenge for a lot of kids. And some of the kids need us to, they have wheelchairs, they have feeding tubes and things like that. So self-contained typically means they have high needs, and those needs are met in a classroom that is very specific.
I think that'd be very important for people watching this video to understand.
I just say it, but I think maybe only educators would know it.
So to piggyback off that, I'm going to get a little controversial here. You as a male teacher, is there an advantage as a male teacher in the classroom?
I would say, oddly, culturally sometimes. So for instance, in a lot of times I have seen from my 16 years of being in Maryville, I'm not going to speak for the whole,
Absolutely.
Mexican American population, but a lot of times I've seen that their family structures are a hierarchy of the males and the females, right? And so the men and the women. And so what happens is a lot of times in classes I've noticed that sometimes women teachers are saying, man, I can't get this student to listen, settle down, behave, etc. And I'm saying I have no problems at all. If I say sit, everyone sits. If I say, so I think there's some slight advantages in that. But, earlier in my career, I thought it was tricky because it is really funny. Being a man, I think the world was expecting me to also be thinking about women all the time. You know what I'm saying? Where I'm like, I'm coming here to work. So it's, it's one of those things where it was just like, if a female student came into my class after school, it would be like, make sure the door is propped open. So there were some disadvantages for being a man, but I do think with sometimes behavioral modification and things like that, sometimes a big voice, sometimes just because family structures are often like that. Depends on
Mr. Neal, you keep saying sometimes, and I'm inclined to think that more than sometimes. That's
you're right. I would say most of the time.
I'm thinking from the mind of a kid and a young man, particularly a young black man in a classroom.
Yeah.
We definitely didn't play with the male teachers.
Black folks and the Latino boys, yeah, it is. That is almost all of the time.
Okay.
So if I say sometimes, I'm closer to 100% than I am a 50%.
Right.
It is definitely, I can say a thing, and those folks are saying, okay, let me listen, because they don't play that in our houses and things like that.
Right, and you're still going to get someone that's going to challenge you.
Of course.
Because, particularly puberty and things like that, you're going to get that.
Of course.
But I think overall, perhaps maybe that's a benefit. Now, the negative part of that is kind of what you've already alluded to a little bit about, making sure you're kind of in the right place with certain students and stuff like that, which should be a concern for any teacher.
Right, it shouldn't be just the men.
Right. So we still got that kind of little stigma there with that. Thank you so much for that. That was very
And raising your voice. A lot of people looked at that like, oh, he's being aggressive. And sure, my blackness probably came into play too. But, I had a parent say, what is he, a football player or something? I was like, I'm a teacher. I'm a teacher. I'm your child's teacher.
Absolutely.
You know what I'm saying?
I have concerns about that as well, because I think overall people understand that, they recognize that, but for whatever reason they still want to kind of control that dynamic, because number one, you are a man, and African American men, we have a tonality and a bass in our voice that when we speak, it's not anger, and it's always identified as anger.
That's right.
And everyone else have that full range of emotion that they could express, up to anger.
That's right.
But somehow it's an exception for us. So I can imagine in this environment that you have to kind of always be mindful.
You're just mindful. You're mindful of all the things, right? You're mindful of all things.
Yeah.